We are continuing on in Beyond Order's first rule. Do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. And in this video, we're going to talk about some cognitive and perception-ish stuff in the sections, the point of pointing, what should we point to, and bottom up. So, in other words, we're going to talk about the point of pointing. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, welcome back to the channel. We are making progress in this book. Slow progress, but progress nonetheless. As I mentioned at the outset of this rule, it is a long one, 50 pages, so it's going to take some time, and that's okay. By the end of this video, we will be about halfway through the total number of sections in this chapter, so yay! And I think that's all I've really got to say at the outset here, so let us commence with the traditional recapping of the visual shorthand I use in these videos. This means I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm responding to the book, or integrating my thoughts with science. And thankfully with Peterson in these sections, it's actually all science, which is a welcome change of pace from the past couple videos I've done. Alrighty, without further ado, let's get to the bottom pointing. That's not right. We start this section with Peterson describing his granddaughter doing toddler things as a toddler, and the action du jour is pointing. How much do you want to bet this is going to be AIM 2.0? AIM 1.0 was found mostly in the original's Rule 4. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today, and included assertions like, your aim determines what you see. Some statements about cognition and perception, where Peterson seemed to miss some important details about how our vision works. That there aren't really any atheists because everyone believes in something, as demonstrated by their actions, which led to Peterson helpfully informing us that we can't understand ourselves, but we can work to remedy this situation by not thinking and just paying attention super hard. Hey Max. What's up, bud? Ooh. You wanna come here? Mr. Fuzz. Ugh. Am I gonna have to hold you like this? But perhaps I'm jumping the gun. Let's see what the point of pointing is. Peterson's granddaughter liked to point at things, especially when adults took interest. This indicated, in a manner not duplicable in any other way, that her action and intention had import, definable at least in part as a tendency of a behavior or attitude to compel the attention of others. She thrived on that, and no wonder. We compete for attention, personally, socially, and economically. No currency has a value that exceeds it. Children, adults, and societies wither on the vine in its absence. I'm gonna have to hold him like this. I won't totally disagree here. We are a social species after all. And the economic value of our attention has become quite the topic, thanks to the tech giants and their finely tuned algorithms. I'm going to assume this society's withering in the absence of attention links back to part of the original's Rule 8, tell the truth or at least don't lie, with culture needing to be attended to as it's always near dead. This is an archetypal, not that type, example of Peterson's somewhat vague writing leaving things open for interpretation, which then could possibly enhance the perceived wisdom of what's being said. Certainly, we know that kids need what could be called attention while they're developing to not later experience cognitive deficits. And this past year has negatively impacted a lot of people's mental health, at least in part because they've been isolated from others. But societies withering on the vine without attention, what exactly does that mean? To have others attend to what you find important or interesting is to validate, first, the importance of what you're attending to, but second, and more crucially, to validate you as a respected center of conscious experience and contributor to the collective world.
Pointing is, as well, a crucial precursor to the development of language. To name something, to use the word for the thing, is essentially to point to it, to specify it against everything else, to isolate it for use individually and socially.
Another carryover from 12 Rules is his talking about relatively minor or inconsequential things like they have huge importance. My marginal note in the book for this is no small acts. But I will admit in this instance that I don't entirely disagree with this sentiment. If I'm trying to share something with somebody, like a funny video, and they can't be bothered, that hurts. It sort of feels like what I'm trying to share, and by extension, me, isn't that important. So I can definitely relate to this. But putting it into the context of validating you as a respected center of conscious experience and contributor to the collective world is a bit much. How we came to have language is still a hotly debated topic. What Peterson said seems to be coming from a gesture-first perspective, but that isn't a universally accepted explanation. And if that is where Peterson's coming from, he's mischaracterizing the theory. It's not just about pointing. It's about communicating with gestures as a whole and language coming from that. Pointing is just a subtype of gesture. Let's continue to disagree. Peterson says that pointing is a public act. There isn't much reason to point at things when you're by yourself. This is absolutely a source memory fail. I can't remember details enough to be able to search for it meaningfully and have anything come back, or remember where I even encountered it in the first place, so take all of this with a grain of salt. I remember learning about an interesting interplay between vision and other areas of the brain, where if you're trying to search for something, saying the name of that thing out loud or doing hand motions associated with that thing can help it pop out to you. And I certainly take advantage of this. So if I'm looking for, like, my scissors, I will walk around the house going, scissors? Scissors? And it seems like it helps me find the thing I'm looking for. And given Peterson's talk about pointing being roughly equivalent to naming something, this would suggest that there is some utility in pointing when you're by yourself. His granddaughter, when pointing, was also getting feedback from those around her if the thing she was pointing to mattered to others or not.
If you are not communicating about anything that engages other people, then the value of your communication, even the value of your very presence, risks falling to zero. It was in this manner that she began to more profoundly explore the complex hierarchy of value that made up her family and the broader society surrounding her.
0 social capital. That's pretty fucking dire, and I'm sure this is putting the people with social anxiety right at ease. Consider the lobster. They too learned the importance of the dominance hierarchy at an early age. And look at that! We're paralleling the original's Rule 1. And no small acts are still in play, learning about the social value hierarchy by pointing at stuff. His granddaughter has since moved on to talking, with Peterson noting that words are essentially pointers for the thing it represents. But not just that. It's also a simplification of the thing because it lumps in that thing with the other stuff similar to it. His example is the word floor. He says we don't typically employ words that would indicate what it's made out of, the texture, or the color. Floors are a broad category of things to stand on, which distinguishes it from things like walls, so it's at a sufficient level of detail. He's sort of talking about categorization here, and categorization is a useful cognitive process for a couple reasons. First, as Peterson's been talking about, these are pointers to knowledge. As such, putting something into a category can provide a lot of general info about the item, while also highlighting how it's different from other members in the category. Working in Peterson's floor example, a concrete floor is like other floors in that something to stand and walk on pretty safely, but is going to be relatively more durable and resilient than something like a wood or mud floor. Second, it can help us to understand novel things. You are encountering a new type of flooring while in a different country. You have some understanding of how floors typically work, so you can assume some basics and focus on what makes this new type of flooring unique. Third, being able to quickly categorize something may have had an evolutionary advantage. Encountering a new animal in the environment, it was useful, nay, essential, to be able to quickly lump it in with things that were going to try to eat you or not. I'm going to skirt around how categorization computationally happens to stay mostly on topic here. What Peterson's talking about here, intentionally or not, is that we tend to use a basic category level when we're talking about stuff. And it's almost surprising that Peterson didn't go into this because another hierarchy is involved. To explain, we can conceptualize the way that we tend to talk and think about things on roughly 3 levels of, let's say, resolution. We'll use vehicles as an example here. There's the global, superordinate level. This is the least specific form, so it has the lowest amount of detail, but also the widest membership. Vehicle can mean all sorts of things. At the bottom, there's the specific, subordinate level. This provides much more info than the superordinate level, which may or may not be needed, depending on the situation. In the middle is the basic level. This is the more generic descriptor for stuff. Car, truck, bike. It's more specific than the global descriptor, but not as specific as the specific descriptor. This has been called the psychologically privileged level, as we tend to default to talking about stuff at this relatively generic but not too broad level. But this is context sensitive. Sometimes you need that level of specificity, and so can talk about the make, model, year of the vehicle. And we're hitting another problem carried over from the first book. Peterson talks about this like there's no room for context to change things, but it can and does. We can talk about concrete versus wood floors. Just because we generally don't, doesn't mean that we're always simplifying the world in this way. He also claims that we use a low-resolution representation of things without really elaborating on what that means. And as I described, the basic level that I was talking about is not incredibly specific, but does contain some detail. So if anything, the low-resolution representation would be at the global level, not the psychologically privileged basic level. But acknowledging that would likely derail his point, so this next portion mirrors what I mentioned earlier from Rule 4.
The words we employ are tools that structure our experience, subjectively and privately, but are equally socially determined. We would not all know and use the word floor unless we had all agreed that there was something sufficiently important about floors to justify a word for them.
It's unclear to me how deterministic Peterson is intending this lingual structuring of experience to be. I feel like this is something I had to have talked about before, but besides the original book's overture video, I'm not finding it in my scripts, so here we go, jumping into language and diving for linguistic relativity. The question at the heart of this is how much language structures or influences the way we think. One position, known as the strong or deterministic version, comes from Sapir and Worf. This is the deterministic position because it's argued that language determines or controls how you perceive and think. The apocryphal story of the insert whatever European colonial force is happening here, ship not being seen by the indigenous people because they didn't have a word or concept to represent them would be an example of this. Do note that this position has largely been discredited. The weak version, where language can influence perception and thought, has seen more support. An example is comparing English and Spanish speakers in a surprise memory test on a scenario where a person broke a vase, either intentionally or accidentally. In either case, the average way to express this event in English is Sam broke the vase, so the person who did it is part of the description. But the way this will commonly be expressed in Spanish is, when accidental, the vase broke, leaving out the person who did it. The interesting result here was that there was a difference in remembering who broke the vase when it was an accident, with Spanish speakers having lower recall than English speakers. When it was intentionally broken, there was no recall difference. A little more clarity from Peterson here would resolve this potential nut-eyeing from me. A possible tripping point hinges on what Peterson means by the social and socially determined, and we're going to get into some armchair anthrophilosophizing here. If you think about it, at some point in time, someone had to come up with the words that make up our language. These are arbitrary representations of stuff, after all. And I'm not saying something like Adam naming all the animals in the Garden of Eden, but somebody at some point had to come up with the word for the various things. Like telephone. Wikipedia puts forward a couple people who may have come up with it, but the point remains. Somebody came up with telephone to represent telephones. So this wasn't really socially determined so much as somebody or a couple somebodies coming up with telephone to describe this new thing, and as the thing spread, so did the name for it. I think things having names aren't really determined by the inherent value or importance of those things. All sorts of things have names. And we quickly fall into a bit of an idea rabbit hole, as some arguably valueless things like human wastes have names. But then the case could be made that they have value because if you don't take care of them, bad things happen, as lack of sanitation can indicate. Or what about zero? It's literally the absence of value, but it's still conceptually important. But grand scheme, how important are things like fidget spinners or truck nuts? Yet, these are named things. Although, words that don't have utility or purpose will fall out of use, so, that could... Nope. We're gonna stop now before I disappear up my own ass. Final thing is an observation. It would appear that pointing is this book's version of aim, as it's occupying a very similar place in Peterson's arguments.
So, the mere fact of naming something, and of course, agreeing on that name, is an important part of the process whereby the infinitely complex world of phenomena and fact is reduced to the functional world of value. And it is continual interaction with social institutions that make this reduction, this specification, possible.
Can a thing exist in this infinitely complex world that we haven't named in some capacity? Or if it does, it seems like it'll be named pretty soon after it's discovered. And doesn't that mean that everything then has value, which makes this name equals importance equals value argument fall apart? I doubt longtime viewers will be surprised that this will lead to hierarchies down the road. But hey, look at that! Partial title name drop. 12 Rules is typically wouldn't happen until the end of the chapter. Good job, Peterson. And to your guess now for what social institutions he's talking about here. I do acknowledge that we have to interact with others in order to keep our internal dictionaries up to date. Yeet is probably my favorite of the newer editions, especially when it was finally explained to me in a way that made sense as the opposite of yoink. This again feels like a no small axe, since Peterson has built up to this point, saying that words structure experience, but the meanings are socially determined. Therefore, society determines your perception and cognition. However, as illustrated by Abby in her recent PhilosophyTube video, going full 1984 Big Brother with regards to LGBT-related language did not ultimately result in those identities disappearing. Delayed for some, maybe. More suffering while trying to figure out oneself? Totally.
The social world narrows and specifies the world for us, marking out what is important. But what does important mean? How is it determined? The individual is molded by the social world, but social institutions are molded too by the requirements of the individuals who compose them.
Okay, I know he's building on the linguistic relativism from the last section here, but how does this work exactly? He's talking around this, but hasn't actually said how this happens, just taking it as a given. The case could be made that how is beside the point, but I'd argue that this seems like a pretty fundamental assertion of how we work that isn't explained or supported. Just that it happens, and now we're moving on to ramifications. This view that social institutions are shaped by people is probably why Peterson's so threatened by the postmodern neo-Marxists. He doesn't want things shaped in a way that he doesn't like, which, fair enough, nobody does. But arguing against progressive policies because the traditional way we did things was better ignores how much oppression and suffering those traditional ways caused. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is basically described without being directly named. I don't think he talked about Maslow's hierarchy in the first book either. Weird. If you aren't familiar, the idea behind the hierarchy of needs is that our different drives, needs, motivations, desires, what have you, can be structured into a hierarchy. The further down the hierarchy a need is, the more fundamental it is to survival, and so needs to be taken care of before you can work on stuff higher up the hierarchy. The parts of the hierarchy can be divided into categories. This will be relevant to what's coming up in the book. I've seen 2 or 3, depending on who's talking. The physiological and safety needs can be considered basic, as these are pretty important for survival. Belonging and love and esteem needs tend to be called psychological, as these aren't as critical for bare-bones survival, but important for your general psychological state. At the top are the self-fulfillment needs, where you can really work on yourself as a person. While this hierarchy is an interesting way to think about these different needs and everything, it has seen a fair amount of criticism. Some of these criticisms are things like Maslow deriving this hierarchy on his sense of how people he considered to be self-actualizing ticked. Progression through the hierarchy isn't a linear thing, and you can have needs unmet lower in the hierarchy but still be pursuing stuff higher above. So is this hierarchy that useful? Hard to say. Peterson basically describes a hierarchy, with the physiological needs taking priority and getting sorted, skips the safety needs, instead going directly to love and belonging sorts of needs and stopping there. He calls all of these needs, like food, shelter, and intimacy, biological as well as psychological needs. I have no idea why Peterson is saying that everything is biological and psychological. None. He just says they are and moves on. Maybe he's not bringing up Maslow because of those categories I mentioned before. Peterson's basically just lumping everything into one bin, while Maslow's work kept those categories separate. No shortage of head scratchers with Peterson.
And the fact that we are deeply social adds another set of constraints on the situation. We must perceive and act in a manner that meets our biological and psychological needs. But, since none of us lives or can live in isolation, we must meet them in a manner approved by others. This means that the solutions we apply to our fundamental biological problems must also be acceptable and implementable socially.
How do we perceive in a socially acceptable manner? I can understand how actions could be done in a socially acceptable way, but perceiving? Is this a dog whistle? Like, I don't see race? This really just has me stumped and confused, which is always a great position when reading life advice. Notably, this requirement of meeting needs in a way acceptable to others leaves out the person's boundaries and general input. If you're meeting a need, it must be done in a way that doesn't get a tutting from others. Something we saw in the first 12 rules was an overarching theme of, but what would the neighbors think, driving at least some of the advice. That's apparently continuing into this set of rules. And I don't know if this is woven into the subtext here, but think about the relatively recent progress made for the LGBT community's rights. Meeting love needs in a socially acceptable way when it wasn't or isn't socially acceptable to be your authentic self? Not a great implication, Peterson. The Peterson pivot is apparently still a writing technique in this book.
It is worth considering more deeply just how necessity limits the universe of viable solutions and implementable plans.
Seriously, it feels like there's a paragraph missing here. But at least his ability to follow through with numbered lists has improved. Necessity limits plans and solutions in 3 ways. The plan has to solve an actual problem, the solution or plan has to appeal to and work for others, and these must work in a sustainable manner. There is no elaboration on the first point, which would have been really helpful. I guess another carryover from the previous book is Peterson's propensity to stay at a vague, abstract level without explanation for those chunks of advice. Neat. The explanation for the second point is a bit weird.
If I value something, therefore, I must determine how to value it so that others potentially benefit. It cannot just be good for me. It must be good for me and for the people around me. And even that is not good enough, which means there are even more constraints on how the world must be perceived and acted upon. The manner in which I view and value the world, integrally associated with the plans I am making, has to work for me, my family, and the broader community.
I thought we were talking about solutions and plans. What's this about valuing stuff so other people will too? Why do these have to be good for everyone else? Why is perception coming into this? A concrete example would help so much here, but of course there isn't one. Mayhaps this is part of his wise persona. This statement can be interpreted in many different ways, dependent on what the interpreter is bringing into it. And because it's in this abstract form, you have to think to get at that interpretation, potentially making you feel smarter in the process. And then it's only natural to think that the person who brought you to that thought or realization is smarter than you. I could just be overthinking this myself. Something valued and solutions to problems must work for yourself and others. Eh, Comrade Peterson? Final thing here. A couple months ago now, Peterson had Abigail Schreier on his podcast. Schreier wrote Irreversible Damage about young trans men. Towards the end of their conversation, Peterson basically said gender transition is a selfish act.
Makes you wonder too when you're doing analysis of the outcomes of surgery.
Oh, we're back to talking about the
take
dicks.
into account the effects of that on the immediate family members, if that's a valid scientific question.
What?
You know what I mean? That, like, you could say, look,
God.
the only person who's ever affected by a surgery is the person upon whom the surgery is performed. And perhaps that's the case, and perhaps that's a reasonable perspective, but we are embedded in familial structures, and if a surgical procedure makes person A temporarily happy, or even maybe happy over the long run, but devastates 5 other people, it seems to me that it's at least worth asking the question of whether
Oh my god. Oh my god. So somebody's not allowed to get a bottom surgery because their family's gonna be upsetty spaghetti? I understand the importance of family, but to put it lightly, not everybody's family is a good fit for them. Something valued or a solution to a problem that works for the person but not the family isn't automatically bad because the family doesn't like it. It's ultimately that person's life, not their family's, not society's, just their own. Ideally, there would be a balance and harmony between the person and their family and society, but we don't live in that ideal world. Telling people to live their life differently because you don't like how they're living it is a bit authoritarian, don't you think, Peterson? The explanation for the third point is that a good solution to something involving suffering must be repeatable without deterioration across repetitions, iterable in a word, across people and across time, and that it doesn't make things worse in the future. This sentiment's a little funny coming from the guy who said we needed to chill it with the environmentalism because it makes people feel bad. I don't understand why a good solution needs to be valid across time. Cultural contexts change on a large time scale, and personal context can change on a shorter one. A good solution needs to be adaptable. For a sizable chunk of the world, the solution to the problem of am hungry, need food is different now than it was a couple hundred years ago or a couple thousand years ago. Is this a stealth version of Peterson's recurring emphasis on tradition good? We're skipping the parts where Peterson demonstrates the universality of these constraints, not because it's overly long or wordy, but because it's not there.
These universal constraints, manifest biologically and imposed socially, reduce the complexity of the world to something approximating a universally understandable domain of value. That is exceptionally important because there are unlimited problems and there are hypothetically unlimited potential solutions, but there are a comparatively limited number of solutions that work practically, psychologically, and socially simultaneously.
All of this then implies that there is an underlying natural ethic. He's not done with this natural ethic, but we're going to jump in here. He's continuing this argument from a foundation that hasn't been founded, like universal constraints and so forth. It really seems like all this needs to be explicitly laid out, not just set on the table as fact. And on some level, sure, we all need to eat and whatnot. You could then make the case that because we devote time to these things, we must value them, as Peterson argues. But that switching between value and problems is troublesome for me. All in all, this seems like a deepity. Yeah, there are tons of problems and solutions, and not all solutions are great solutions. And I feel like so much of this could be the life advice version of the aristocrats joke. Just swap out that punchline with tradition. You ready for this to take a turn?
It is the reality of this natural ethic that makes thoughtless denigration of social institutions both wrong and dangerous. Wrong and dangerous because those institutions have evolved to solve problems that must be solved for life to continue. They are by no means perfect, but making them better rather than worse is a tricky problem indeed.
This is a more subtle example of Peterson, knower of what's going on inside your head. But how does he think he knows whether or not a criticism has been done thoughtlessly? As if a ton of thought hasn't been put into some of the things he doesn't like critical race theory. His choice of words, though, thoughtless denigration. Not thought out, unfair criticism. Always gotta go for the $10 word, don't ya, Dr. P? To pull my own pretentious quote, The bureaucracy is expanding to meet the needs of the expanding bureaucracy. Social institutions can experience negative feedback loops, where negative norms, unchecked growth, bad things just get worked into the system. Criticism is a part of reform. Does he think that progressives just want to make things worse by trying to fix stuff? He probably does. He does. How does one simplify the world to allow for action in a way that's mindful of others? Having some sort of explicit idea for the scope of what he's talking about would be helpful here, because it reads, to me at least, like he's talking about all levels of perception and cognition and social interaction. But I interrupted. So terribly rude. I really need to get over this habit. Here's how he says we can accomplish this task.
By communicating and negotiating. By outsourcing the terribly complex cognitive problem to the resources of the broader world. The individuals who compose every society cooperate and compete linguistically, although linguistic interaction by no means exhausts the means of cooperation and competition. Words are formulated collectively, and everyone must agree on their use. The verbal framework that helps us delimit the world is a consequence of the landscape of value that is constructed socially, but also bounded by the brute necessity of reality itself. That helps give the landscape shape, and not just any old shape. This is where hierarchies, functional, productive hierarchies, more clearly enter the picture.
Already addressed a lot of these components, so won't renope them here, but tradition. I assume this assertion about cooperative and competitive language is coming from his stance that language determines social behaviors, but this paragraph seems to be suggesting a strong directive force for how we act. Is this why he's so against using people's pronouns? If we, as a society, force them into pronouns assigned at birth, then the problem of the non-cisgenders will disappear, except for the whole part where trans, non-binary, and/or gender non-conforming people have always existed, lingual capacity to label it or not. Why is the verbal framework a consequence of social values? Give me something tangible beyond the argument that word meanings are linked to collective value. But of course, this all boils down to hierarchies again. But not Maslow's. Never Maslow's. Time for a Peterson logic flow. Things low on what basically amounts to Maslow's hierarchy of needs need to happen, otherwise people die. But these need to be, quote, specified and planned, for some reason. To be able to do that, you need to have the skills to meet those needs, for some reason. Tradition? Rolling out the above in an informed plan requires others, either as help or competition. Does not follow, but go off, Chief. Because of that, there is variability in solving problems. Given the differential ability and the simple fact that everyone can't be masters of everything, hierarchies based on competence are a necessary outcome. Therefore, hierarchies are a socially structured tool to solve problems, and a fundamental social institution that allows for progress. What? One of the things Peterson indicated people would die from is loneliness, in addition to thirst or lack of shelter. How is loneliness solved in this? I can understand things like hunger being solved by skilled food makers and distributors, but loneliness? Peterson sex worker positive confirmed? Just kidding. No, of course not. I don't disagree that specialization is a part of living in a larger scale society. And I also don't disagree that there's going to be variability in how well people can do whatever that specialization is. But is this going somewhere? Short answer, yes. And where it is going... Peterson may have delayed the argument from nature this time around, but he isn't not going to make that argument.
The consensus, making up the spoken and unspoken assumptions of worth characterizing our societies, has an ancient origin, developing over the course of hundreds of millions of years. After all, how should you act is just the short-term, immediate version of the fundamental long-term question, how should you survive?
On some level, this almost makes sense. Why do things that ultimately don't benefit our survival? But it doesn't really capture all experience. Why do we enjoy things like pets or art or getting absolutely shit-faced? I suppose the case could be made that pets are helpful for survival historically, as they kept pest populations down or helped guard the food. But in the modern age, is it because they're stress reducers? And what about art? I imagine Peterson would frame this as a means in conveying the social norms and values, but that falls apart in many types of art. Maybe he has a really limited definition of what art can be. And pursuing oblivion in some form? Hijacking dopamine reward systems?
It is therefore instructive to look into the distant past, far down the evolutionary chain, right to the basics, and contemplate the establishment of what is important. The most phylogenetically ancient multicellular organisms, that is far enough for our purposes, tend to be composed of relatively undifferentiated sensory motor cells.
Peterson spends a bit building up the complexity of the organism, from the aforementioned undifferentiated sensory motor cell having organisms, to those with a divide between sensation and motor actions, and those with neural intermediaries. Reference 1 is a paper primarily focusing on how C. elegans, a type of nematode, navigates from a neural processing perspective. I'm honestly struggling a bit here. Peterson doesn't say anything on the order of melting lobster brains wrong, but taking a look at the information processing in C. elegans, and it seems like there's a fair bit of differentiation. The paper does say that navigation can be a task for a single cell, as with eukaryotes that have cilia, but it not too much later adds that all animals have specialized neural circuits. I guess part of the trouble is his use of undifferentiated not quite mapping onto my understanding of it in this context. The point of Peterson going biological is to say that the more complex animals have more complex responses to stimuli. Complex, in this sense, being sort of along the lines, at least in part, to what I commonly call noise. Doing cognitive research, even at a pretty basic level of stimulus appears, person responds with a button press, people find ways to not do this in a way that you would predict. Maybe they're pushing the wrong button, which does happen even when you have meticulously labeled the buttons they need to push. Maybe they're just distracted with something. Maybe they're crying. Any number of things could be introducing variability into the data, which is statistical noise.
As the layers of neural tissue mediating between sensation and action multiply, they also differentiate. Basic motivational systems, often known as drives, appear. Hunger, thirst, aggression, etc., adding additional sensory and behavioral specificity and variability. Superseding motivations, in turn, with no clear line of demarcation, are systems of emotion. Cognitive systems emerge much later, first taking form, arguably, as imagination, and later, and only among human beings, as full-fledged language. Thus, in the most complex of creatures, there is an internal hierarchy of structure, from reflex through to drive to language-mediated action, in the particular case of human beings, that must be organized before it can function as a unity and be aimed at a point.
A lot of this hinges on how exactly these different terms are being defined. What is meant by emotion? The more common pets that we keep seem to have emotional experiences. Like when a fellow pet stops occupying the same space as them, they can go into something that looks like mourning. What is meant by cognitive systems? Especially since the first form is set to be imagination. And why is imagination the first cognitive system? I could give an educated guess that he means stuff like planning and mental representation of stuff not currently present, but is that actually what he means? If so, why not just say that? To be a little pedantic, yes, humans appear to be the only species with a fully developed language, but other animals are quite capable of communication. Peterson is limiting this argument, and I'm not sure why. Part of the point of his included reference is that this hierarchical organization is largely conserved across species. I also just want to add that this last sentence is odd. I'm not sure if he's intending this, but it's not like an organism would plop into existence with these systems not organized. In the fine detail, there can sometimes be wonky wiring leading to things like synesthesia, but in terms of gross structures, short of birth defects, it's all organized. But then there's that little sliver of wiggle room where the case could be made that he's talking about the early developmental processes where an organism's brain gets tuned to the body it's operating in and the environment. Is that what he meant? Who knows? Why follow your own life advice about being precise and clear in your speech? Oh yeah, reference 2 puts forward a model of how motivated behavior is organized and wired in the brain. It doesn't seem to say anything about language or imagination or the like, so Peterson seems to be overreaching a bit here. But of course, we're coming back to this aim point again.
How is this hierarchy organized? A structure that emerged in large part from the bottom up, over the vast spans of evolutionary time. We return to the same answer alluded to earlier, through the constant cooperation and competition, the constant jockeying for resources and position, defining the struggle for survival and reproduction. This happens over the unimaginable lengthy spans of time that characterize evolution, as well as the much shorter course of each individual life.
I think I understand what he means by bottom up in this context, as the building up in complexity as life diversified and specialized, and maybe it would be apparent to the lay reader from the previous context, but, as indicated by reference 2, the organization in the brain is hardly a clean hierarchical structure. There's all kinds of loops and complications. But how could this neural and cognitive hierarchy have formed from the top down? Just be clear in your writing, Peterson, come on. Let's take a second to parse the latter part of this quote. The neural hierarchy is organized through cooperation and competition. He thinks he's playing fast and loose with the meaning of hierarchy here, since he's putting it into the individual lifetime scale.
Negotiation for position sorts organisms into the omnipresent hierarchies that govern access to vital resources such as shelter, nourishment, and mates. All creatures of reasonable complexity and even a minimally social nature have their particular place and know it.
Yep, we are just flipping the meaning and context of hierarchy. Guess he hasn't moved on from that writing habit, which I wish he would have, because it drives me up the wall. He would be well at home as a character in one of Lewis Carroll's stories.
All social creatures also learn what is deemed valuable by other group members, and derive from that, as well as from the understanding of their own position, a sophisticated implicit and explicit understanding of value itself. In a phrase, the internal hierarchy that translates facts into actions mirrors the external hierarchy of social organization.
In a shocking deviation from established form, Peterson provides an example. Chimpanzees know their place within the troop. This means that they understand what is important and who has priority with it. It bugs me that he hasn't nailed down what he means by value. It's always inferred from context, which changes pretty frequently. And nothing new there. Reference 3 is about potential motivations behind prosocial behavior, particularly in primates. Part of this includes trying to operationalize empathy. Hierarchies do make an appearance in this paper, but once again, it isn't close to the point of the paper. What is this about internal and external hierarchies? How is it mirrored? Because they're both hierarchies? No. While synaptic pruning is a thing that happens as an organism grows, this is hardly the same thing as how groups or organisms organize themselves. The maturational process of humans is discussed in many more words than I'm using here, building up from simple reflexes up to more complex behaviors. Peterson describes how kids shift from being driven by their basic needs to being able to integrate those with the social environment. Reference 4 is a Peterson and Flanders book chapter called Play and the Regulation of Aggression and is helpfully posted on his website. It's largely about the dominance hierarchy. Surprising, I know. There's also a little Freud, some Piaget, and talk of games. Reminiscent of the original 12 Rules for Life, Rule 11. Games are going to be a bit of a motif moving forward. Citing a book by Piaget, Peterson says that playing with others requires a shared goal between participants. This goal has to be established as a group. This is a social microcosm because a play or game has rules about how the players can interact, either competitively or cooperatively. Peterson extends this to say that societies are larger scale games, and for a society to be functional, the rules have to be fair, with reciprocation expected between players. The game also has to be iterable to continue to be played, and played willingly. Peterson notes that other primates play games too. Reference 5, the Piaget book, is not helpfully posted on Peterson's website, or anywhere really, so That's going to have to be passed over. Reference 6 is a book by the author who wrote Reference 3. The synopsis indicates this book is about the evolutionary development of morality. Cool. It's not just primates who play games. You may recall in the original's Rule 12, Peterson said that cats aren't social, which the research seems to disagree with. Our little furry friends are also quite capable of playing games. Peterson's universal rules of fair play: emotional regulation, motivational regulation, cooperation or competition in pursuit of the goal, reciprocally beneficial interactions. Peterson says that life is a series of games. These have a starting point that can be grown upon in pursuit of a goal. Okay, sure. If you want to define things that broadly, sure.
Because of that commonality, there is an ethic, or more properly, a meta-ethic, that emerges from the bottom up across the set of all games. The best player is therefore not the winner of any given game, but, among other things, he or she who is invited by the largest number of others to play the most extensive series of games.
This is explained a little bit with children being told the old line about, it's not whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game. I think this is where the metaphor breaks a little. Peterson's redefining what the best player is to fit where he's going. I guess all of the Hall of Fames can go fuck themselves, which strikes me as a little incongruous with Peterson's emphasis on hierarchies. Does this mean there is only one true hierarchy? All the others don't matter?
There can be only one.
This even goes against some of what he was talking about in the first book, with hierarchies being a good thing so he can appreciate attractive women. While we're talking about 12 rules, this is echoing his chapter on raising kids. One of his benchmarks for good parenting was that the child would practically be fighting off play invites from other kids and parents with a stick. And to repeat myself, this doesn't take into account the interests of the person, just what would get them the highest number of invites. But we'll expand on this in a few. I'll also mention that this is where the ludicrously long footnote appears. Goes from there, and it's so long that it continues over here. It's a long footnote. When you have a footnote that long, dude, either work it into the text proper or cut it down. Seriously. The contents are an extensive review of how rats play, which, don't get me wrong, I love me some playing rats or tickling rats or just rats. But like I said, either work this into the text or trim the detail down.
How should you play to be that most desirable of players? What structure must take form within you so that such play is possible? And those two questions are interrelated because the structure that will enable you to play properly and with increasing and automated or habitual precision will emerge only in the process of continually practicing the art of playing properly. Where might you learn how to play? Everywhere, if you are fortunate and awake.
As we talked about in the first book, there probably isn't one playing strategy that will work for everybody. To borrow from my commentary there, consider the cuttlefish. Some males are doing the whole, I'm a big guy with good genes, let me pass you my spunk nugget. But some males sneak in on the side, tricking the big dudes into thinking they're another female to more covertly do the deed, sometimes right under the big guy's tentacles. And that's getting at another problem I kept having with that book. When advice was specific enough, it was generally in a one-size-fits-all package, which doesn't work. If it was couched in language indicating that this was one way to try to grow as a person, to improve your life, to fix things, it would be a different matter. But the way Peterson wrote was very much more, this is how you need to banish chaos from your life. This is how you need to live your life. The current text is assuming that Peterson's most desirable player type is true for everyone. I agree that getting along with others is generally good, but wouldn't it be better to live in a way that works for you rather than trying to min-max yourself to accrue a higher game count? Not everyone wants to play all games, and that is totally fine. We should respect that. Also, some games or co-players may not be worthwhile for others to engage with. Should we go out of our way to invite toxic, manipulative people into our lives? Being in those situations certainly is a different type of game, but is it one that we should necessarily be trying to add to our total game count? And are traditional games something that we need to continue to play? Being successful at capitalism
Jeffrey Bezos, you did it!
has led to near unprecedented levels of inequality, which is arguably not good for society as a whole, which was one of Peterson's stipulations on good solutions earlier. Knowing which games are a good fit for you and why is important. And once again, boundaries are popping into my response to these books. The next section dumps a game metaphor to talk about tarot and, oh, did you look at the time? This seems like a good place to stop. Until next time, bye.